Well, thank you very much indeed, John, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming along tonight. And I mean, I know probably as well as anyone the delights of Edinburgh society, and that you have managed to drag yourself away from them and away from the delights of a hot evening in order to come here and to listen to me and to talk about these fascinating issues is a wonderful thing. And I must say, I read it as testimony to the pulling power of my subject, Adam Smith, rather than anything about the author of this book. I will, however, say that I will be skinned alive by my publisher if I don't show you a copy of this beautiful object, bleeds pages, and colour plates, and also mention that copies will be available for purchase at an absurd discount, and if you really wanted to face them further, signed by the author after this talk. So thank you very much. I must say I'm still relatively new to the book game. I did a signing the other day, and my hand was poised over a copy of the volume, and this extremely distinguished gentleman came up to me. I was located behind a small, in fact, actually a large ziggurat of books, and he leant forward, and I expectantly looked upwards, and he said, "Could you tell me the way to the bathroom?" Extraordinarily deflating experience, if I may say so. Someone who's come ready to talk about the 18th century. So thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I should offer a slight disclaimer, which is that I'm not speaking here today as a member of Parliament or as a minister, but as someone with something of an academic background and an enormous interest in this colossally interesting and important figure. And I want to suggest to you that even today, Adam Smith offers us a treasure trove of wisdom on a vast range of subjects, from economics to politics, to ethics, to social psychology, to game theory, and not just a set of ideas that live today and breathe today and should breathe further in our policymaking, but also a corrective to policymakers who tend to think all too often that they know it all and are unwilling to acknowledge the sad truth that in many ways our understanding has gone backwards since the days of Smith. And perhaps we can discuss some of those issues, if you like, in the Q&A. I should say there are one or two chairs at the front, seats at the front, if anyone would like to come down who may have arrived a bit later on. Now, I should say that it's perhaps just as well that I give you a disclaimer about speaking not as a politician or as a minister, because Adam Smith memorably denounced what he called that insidious and crafty animal, vulgarly called a statesman or politician, whose counsels are directed by the momentary fluctuations of affairs. And I'd like to suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that this week has been a triumphant corrective to that naive and foolish view. And what a delight it is to have escaped the traumas of Westminster and to emerge into the warm and welcoming air of Edinburgh. I must say that quote about insidious and crafty politicians occurs when he discusses trade wars in The Wealth of Nations, how they start and how they escalate. And on your behalf, I think I can only thank President Trump personally for arranging a trade war in order to promote this rather important book. Perfect timing for me, perfect timing for Adam Smith himself. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as you all know, today Adam Smith is alternately celebrated or denounced. For many on the right of politics, he is a founding father of the modern era, the greatest of all economists, an eloquent advocate of laissez-faire, of the invisible hand, of the freedom of the individual, and the staunch enemy of state intervention in a world released from the utopian delusions of communism and socialism. For many on the left, however, he is something very different, the true source and origin of what has been called market fundamentalism, of the idea of homo economicus and the efficient market hypothesis, author of what has been described as the textbook on contemporary capitalism, the prime mover of a materialist ideology that is sweeping the world and corrupting real sources of human value, an apologist for wealth and inequality and human selfishness, and a misogynist to boot. So then, which is the real Adam Smith? And do his ideas have any bearing on the problems and dilemmas of the present moment in an era when an American president is rapidly demolishing orthodox ideas about the value of free trade, and a British shadow chancellor can call openly for the overthrow of capitalism? I think I'll just leave those questions there with you, if I may, hanging while we turn to the man himself. For me, I came to Smith through a book that John's mentioned already, published a few years ago, on Edmund Burke. And Burke and Smith greatly admired each other, and they became close friends towards the end of their life. Smith is reported to have said that Burke is the only man I ever knew who thinks on economic subjects exactly as I do, without any previous communication having passed between us. Now, I'm not sure that's true, but it's a handsome tribute, and it's testimony to the kind of feeling that existed between the two men. And of course, it's often the way that outsiders have the greatest insight into a given society. The caricature, as you will know, is that Napoleon was a Corsican and Hitler was an Austrian and Stalin was a Georgian. And if you want an insightful understanding of the exercise of power, then often it comes from someone outside the society itself. And of course, the same is true for analysis. Now, in the case of Burke and Smith, the same is true here. Burke was an Irishman, Smith a Scot. Both rose through sheer ability to positions of international eminence in their own lifetime at a moment when the Irish and the Scots were widely scorned in England. The reigning assumption when Burke came to London was that an Irishman was after your fortune or your daughter. And in the 1760s, as you may know, England was in the grip of a rampant Scotophobia. Those are not the most promising environments in which to start to influence people and ply your trade. But nevertheless, both came to positions of great seniority and eminence. Both came to advise prime ministers, the Marquis of Rockingham in the case of Burke, William Pitt the Younger in the case of Smith. There's a marvellous story of a meeting attended by Pitt and many of the great figures of the age, including Dundas, Addington, Wilberforce and Grenville. Smith was one of the last guests to arrive, and when he entered the room, the whole company rose from their seats to receive him, and they remained standing. Pitt said, "Be seated, gentlemen." "No, no," replied Pitt. "We will stand till you are first seated, for we are all your scholars." And of course, both Burke and Smith wrote books that utterly transformed our understanding of human affairs. If you want to understand ideology, revolution, extremism, human institutions, representative government, political parties, constitutional democracy, every single one of these matters, a burning issue of today, then you should read Edmund Burke. If you want to understand markets, free trade, economics, crony capitalism, rent extraction, the origins and nature of inequality, power and property, moral and social norms, and the creation of human culture, read Smith. Or, of course, if you want to cheat, you can read the books I've written on both of these great figures. But if you do, I hope you'll go on to read them, because they're extraordinary and transformative thinkers. Now, I thought, having thought quite a long time over a long period about both Smith and Burke, that I understood something about each of them and about their thought. And I certainly thought I knew something about Adam Smith. Let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that actually almost everything I thought I knew was wrong. And actually it was just the tip of a vastly wider whole, an entire continent, still largely undiscovered, of human thought and intellectual achievement. Now, it has to be said that Smith's life was not a great help to this biographer, indeed to any. It is the very pattern of academic uneventfulness. It's not necessarily the way you've heard people selling a biography, ladies and gentlemen, but it was the pattern of academic uneventfulness. He was born, as you will know, in Kirkcaldy in Fife, went first to the University of Glasgow, then to Balliol College, Oxford, which he greatly disliked. Balliol at that time was Jacobite, Tory, factional, expensive, and Scotophobic. And Smith was Presbyterian, Whiggish, sociable, impecunious, and a Scot. So it was not a perfect combination. After a short interval, he went back to Glasgow University as a professor, and then on a tour of France as a tutor to the young Duke of Buccleuch, before finally taking a position here in this city as Commissioner of Customs. Over 40 years he published two books, The Theory of Moral Sentiment, 1759, and The Wealth of Nations, 1776, and very little else. And of his private views, we know remarkably little. In politics, Smith was broadly Whiggish, a term which then implied a belief in the virtues of constitutional monarchy, religious toleration, and personal freedom. But he remained remarkably close-lipped about his own political views throughout his life. He was also famously absent-minded, once being so engrossed in conversation that he famously fell into a tanner's pit. He never married, and he had no children. As far as we know, there were no secret loves, no hidden vices, no undergraduate pranks, no adult peccadillos. When it comes to juicy personal detail, Smith's life is a featureless Sahara. But if his life was uneventful, the times he lived in were tumultuous. And this book, of course, is also a story of those times. Of course, the Act of Union, 1707, bitterly contested at the time, the subject of serious political corruption, and contested indeed even in these days today. It is striking how all the major thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment agreed about the importance of the Union to Scottish development. They regarded it, and Smith regarded it, in his words, as a measure from which infinite good has been derived to this country, a fact of which I regularly remind my Scottish nationalist colleagues in the House of Commons if I'm ever short of a line or in trouble while I'm at the dispatch box. Of course, there were also the Jacobite rebellions, including the rebellion of 1745, in which Bonnie Prince Charlie and his Highlanders came within 100 or so miles of London, and might have taken the city if they hadn't been tricked by false English intelligence, as you will all know. And of course, there's the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63, which was the true First World War, a war in which Britain fought and defeated the French across 4 continents, from Boston to Bengal, averted a French invasion across the Channel, and laid the foundations for good or ill of the First British Empire. A war which included the astonishing victories of 1759, a year in which it was said the bells never stopped ringing, in which Edward Boscawen destroyed the bulk of the French Mediterranean fleet off Lagos in Portugal. Wolfe achieved the seemingly impossible in the Canadian territories with a daring night ascent of the cliffs of the Plains of Abraham, defeating Montcalm and taking French-controlled Quebec. And, of course, Hawke broke the French Atlantic Fleet in an action of astonishing bravery in Quiberon Bay off the coast of Brittany. But, of course, also a war which created debts so ruinous that they pushed Britain into the loss of its American colonies in the War of Independence and cast a long shadow of French indebtedness, which leading ultimately to the French Revolution. And of course, this is a book about the Scottish Enlightenment, that astonishing moment when this country transformed itself, not merely economically, but in cultural and intellectual terms, from the edge, and moved from the edge to the centre of European thought. An amazing, transformative moment. A dazzling array of talent suddenly arose, including, of course, Smith, David Hume, Adam Ferguson, and a host of other figures covering philosophy, the natural sciences, law, history, literature, as well as political economy, social psychology, and ethics. And, of course, highly distinctive in its commitment to personal and social improvement and to the morally equalising effects of education. And I would say fully the intellectual equal of that amazing but better-known generation in London, Dr. Johnson, Burke, Joshua Reynolds, David Garrick, Goldsmith, and Edward Gibbon. Now, Smith and Hume were at the heart of this remarkable intellectual transformation. In many ways, they were an unusual pair. Hume, the older man by 12 years, worldly, open, witty, full of small talk, banter, piercing aperçu, a lover of whist, a gourmand, and a flirt. Smith, by contrast, reserved, private, considered, often rather austere in his public manner, though he could unwind on a Sunday evening in Panmure House amongst his friends. And if Smith is close-handed, Hume is a biographer's dream. He is, as you will know, we live in the shadow of we stand in the shadow of the Hume Tower, but Hume himself, astonishingly funny as well as an astonishingly brilliant man. After his History of England proved to be a tremendous critical and popular success, his publisher entreated him for another volume. Hume memorably replied, I have 4 reasons for not writing. I am too old, too fat, too lazy, and too rich. A sentence which I put to every author has wished to send to his publisher. The last dinner before Hume's death, Smith complained of the cruelty of the world in taking him from them. Hume said, no, 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 here am I, he said, who have written on all sorts of subjects calculated to excite hostility, moral, political, and religious, and yet I have no enemies, except, indeed, all the Whigs, all the Christians, and all the Tories. And if there's ever a moment when I think the narrative needs a bit of a lift, I just go to Hume. He's the best supporting actor, from my point of view, of this book. But, of course, the book is not just about Smith, his times, and his friends. It's also about what he thought and what its contemporary impact is today, why it matters. Now, the fact that he wrote 2 great works in his life and has given rise to a series of misconceptions in many ways. Of course, the first, the theory of moral sentiments, about ethics, the second about political economy, the first long ignored, the second probably the most influential work of social science ever written. Neither book read even by the vast majority of those who quote them. But if we're going to understand Smith's thought, even these 2 books are not enough. In his later years, he confessed to having 2 other great works upon the anvil. One is a sort of philosophical history of all the different branches of literature, of philosophy, poetry, and eloquence. The other is a sort of theory and history of law and government. Neither work was completed, and near his death he instructed his executors Hutton and Black to burn them, and perhaps other works unknown, which they highly reluctantly did. We cannot measure the loss, but they were allowed to spare some important essays on language and astronomy, and miraculously 2 fairly full notes of Samizdat student notes of Smith's lectures on jurisprudence delivered in the early 1760s have survived separately, and these give us important clues. So my job, the job of a biographer, the job of someone thinking to represent Smith, to save him from his admirers and his detractors, is to try to reassemble a picture of these thought from these varied materials. Like some old fossil hunter on the trail of a dinosaur, pull these bits and fragments together, set them in the right relation to each other, and try to bring out the underlying grace and power of the beast as a whole. Let me try to sketch that in a few words now. At the heart of Smith's thought is or perhaps the great Enlightenment project. This is to set out what David Hume described in the Treatise of Human Nature as a science of man, to do what Isaac Newton had done with physics and cosmology and astronomy, to unify them, to bring them together in a general account. But in Smith's case, and in Hume's case, not merely for one fragment of science, but for human life in all its major aspects, deriving from a few basic propositions covering philosophy, religion, political economy, jurisprudence and the arts, as well as the sciences, even language itself, and able in principle to serve as the basis of every other branch of human knowledge. And crucially, this science of man to be based on observation and on experience, and not on natural law, divine inspiration, religious dogma, or any other source of external authority. For Smith, the crucial idea, the linking idea that ties his thought together and that gives it this Newtonian aspect, acclaimed even in his own time, is that of the continuous exchange that occurs in all human interactions, humans being social animals, animals whose identity and existence is formed through interaction with each other. And of course that means famously exchange of goods and services in markets. But it also includes exchange of meanings in language. And it includes exchange of regard and esteem in the formation of moral and social norms and values. And now each of these areas deserves a talk in its own right, and many have been given on those topics. But if we just focus on the most famous form of exchange, the one that everyone thinks they know about Smith, let me just talk about that for a second, market exchange, we can say this, that The Wealth of Nations is not merely a work of inexhaustible genius because it sets out and gathers together many of the central intellectual tools of political economy. What have remained so? The division of labour, the idea of market equilibrium, the effects of incentives on behaviour, the benefits of free trade, the Smith's own 4 maxims of taxation, just to list a few. It is for one foundational move. Smith is the first man or woman to put markets at the centre of political economy. That's the move that transforms that subject. That's the move that makes him the father of economics. But of course for markets for Smith are not the disembodied mathematical construct of modern economics and policy making. They are living institutions embedded in specific cultures and mediated by social norms and trust. They shape and are shaped by their participants in a dynamic and evolving way. They have common features, but they are as different as one another as individual humans are. Markets for land and labour and capital, asset markets from product markets, and the rest of them. And they exist because they have not merely private but public value. Yes, they generate typically economic value, and they're unmatched in their ability to allocate goods and services and encourage innovation and improvement. But they constitute a socially constructed and evolving order that exists and must exist because it serves the public good. And of course, both individual markets and the market system as a whole rely on the state. And one of the things that's so fascinating about Smith, when one starts to think in this way, one situates markets in culture, in trust, is that not only do you bring the two books into a closer relationship with each other, so that instead of being, as some have suggested, opposed, one can see that the norms and the practices and the traditions that are discussed in the theory of moral sentiments become the encasing context of trust within which markets and other institutions of an economic character flourish in the wealth of nations. It is that it gives us so much more nuanced a conception of the state and market as themselves part of an evolving order of political economy in a way that anticipates theories of evolution found in and after Darwin, and of course from which Darwin himself learned very much when he studied Smith and lived in Edinburgh. So let me just say this then. Which of these two great views of Smith that I've described earlier is correct? I think it should be clear by now that neither is true. And indeed, both must be corrected. Smith was more a philosopher than an economist. He was not an advocate of laissez-faire. The invisible hand occurs just once in the wealth of nations. He has more than one specific theory of markets, and he did not oppose all state interventions in markets. Indeed, he positively advocates a range of them. He did not think selfishness was a virtue. He was not a misogynist. He would have been an opponent, not a supporter of the modern idea of market fundamentalism. And homo economicus and the efficient market hypothesis are later ideas that badly distort his own views. And finally, and perhaps most profoundly, capitalism in this modern sense did not develop until 50 to 60 years after the wealth of nations, with the emergence of private corporations as autonomous pools of capital. And Smith himself was, as I outline in detail, a vigorous opponent of the crony capitalism of his own day, laying out principles that we can apply today to crony capitalism in the search for a renewed narrative that ties our understanding of markets and society better together. What mattered for Smith was not capitalism, which carries with it no expectation of its own legitimacy, but commercial society, that moment when society, as perfectly exemplified as he saw it in Scotland's astonishing change in the 18th century, moved from feudalism and the dependence of one person on another to commercial modes of exchange, in which, as he says, every man is in himself a merchant and lives by exchanging. That is a society which offers freedoms not merely to buy and sell, but to live in their own right, for people in their own right, without subordination to others. If you want to know more about this, ladies and gentlemen, you've got the next place to turn is the book I'm holding in my hands. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you've enjoyed what I've said today. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for that, Jesse. I'm sure everyone found that very stimulating, and you probably had a higher laugh rate than many of the performers at the Fringe are likely to enjoy over the next few weeks. You referred at one point to distortions of Smith's thinking. When in the process following the writing of the books can we see the distortions begin to emerge? And to what extent are those distortions shaped by recognisable motivations to change the pattern of his thinking whilst appearing to continue to remain true?
Well, Smith himself is a very complex thinker across different topics, and he's also extremely quotable. So the temptation to grab a bit of Smith, given his astonishing authority, and misuse that quotation to illustrate a point, often for political purposes, it has proved to be overwhelming to many people. And of course that's abetted by the fact that Smith's own authority has been by far the greatest of any economist. So if you look at the citations record of economists, you can look at Keynes and at Marx and at Hayek and at Friedman and some of these great figures, Ken Arrow and the like. You can put them all together and you still don't get to Smith's totals. Smith is by far the most influential. And so what you see over time is this progressive process where it gets wrenched from one context and into another. And of course, the first place this really occurs after he dies is in the 1830s and 40s, when there's an enormous fight going on over free trade and the Corn Laws and the like. And of course, he becomes recruited to that process as an alleged advocate of one side versus the other. And by the time you get to the Smith centenary of 1876, there's a lovely line where Walter Bagehot says, that it's impossible to remember that free trade was once regarded as a dirty word, because the shift in opinion has been so great. And Smith has a very large part. And the other thing that happens, of course, at that time, and happens in a parallel way with Burke in some respects, is that he moves into the background. He becomes the unquestioned context within which argument about economics takes place. And the same thing happens to Burke in the 1880s and 90s. I mean, everyone across the political spectrum just thinks Burke is extraordinary, and the Tories are mining him in one way, and the Liberals are mining him in another, and all the rest of it.
So there's nothing about context, and you made a very persuasive argument about the way in which his thinking had emerged from the context of his times in the 18th century. But some of your examples about ways in which his views have been oversimplified and misrepresented date from the 19th century, and we all know that between 1776 and 1876, social and economic context had changed unrecognisably.
That's true.
In the UK. And is any of this a response to changing context?
Oh, no, I think it's very much a response to changing context. I mean, people see the need for an argument about free trade, and they reach to him for an argument about free trade. And, of course, when you get into the 20th century, in the 1970s, there's a widespread view that the British economy has kind of run into the sand, and whether or not one thinks that's right, and people still dispute it, Smith is being mined by politicians to justify arguments for greater liberalization. And of course the irony, the really interesting thing is that if you are in the 1770s, when Smith is writing The Wealth of Nations, markets at that time are a thicket of state and church and guild regulation. So deregulation, the system of natural liberty, as he describes it, is almost invariably a way towards greater economic welfare and greater equality, because the insiders have been using the rules to privilege themselves. You take away some of the rules and the system becomes a fairer and more equal one. Now, when you get later on and to a position in which you have much freer markets, a much more nuanced conception of the state, I think, is required. And actually, Smith gives you that. I mean, there's a marvelous description, as you may know, when he talks about the failure of the Douglas Heron Bank in 1772. It's the so-called Air Bank, which goes spectacularly bust, taking a lot of Smith's patron, the Duke of Buccleuch's, cash with it. And when it does go bust, Smith analyzes that fairly piteously in The Wealth of Nations, and he attributes it to essentially the kiting of bills of exchange, and explains how this takes over, how the frenzy starts to grip people, how they then start to lobby politicians and the Bank of England not to get in the way of things, and then ultimately how it all goes pop and leaves everyone greatly impoverished. And he says, and for this reason, there must be party walls to prevent a general conflagration in the banking system. And I wish that's a line that I wish our regulators had more in mind in 2007 when they were thinking about the banking system. And of course, the fascinating thing is they had it in mind. You know, if you want a one-sentence description of why the banking system went bust so spectacularly in 2008, I can give it to you. And the sentence is a long one, but do bear with me for a second. So in 1960, bank leverage, that is to say debt as a multiple of equity capital, is about 20 times for the banking system as a whole. In 1970, it's about 20 times. In 1980, it's about 20 times. In 1990, it's about 20 times. In the year 2000, it's about 20 times. In the year 2007, it's 50 times.
Okay, thank you. Let's...
I stunned you to submission, John. I'm so sorry.
I'm bludgeoned by numbers. Yes, absolutely. Let's bring everyone else into the conversation. There are two mics. This is being recorded. So if not for the other people in the room, you would assist anyone trying to listen to the recording if you wait until you have a microphone. Hand at the back, please.
Hi, my name is Chantal Mourimi, and thank you for that talk. I have to say I'm a bit relieved to hear this. I'm originally from Africa, and I grew in very difficult conditions in the 80s and 90s to the point of malnutrition, starvation, you name it, in countries that were rich in minerals. And I grew up with, as much as I looked up to Europe to solve some of the poverty problem, as you know, economic migrants, also in my case coming from Rwanda and the Congo, there was also an element of security problem. And but there was always this, you grow up with this double feeling that you hate the West for capitalism because they had a big hand in continuing to loot resources, natural resources, and give you back very little. So you find Africa very rich in natural resources but very poor in terms of people receiving the benefits. So when I came to the West about 19 years ago, I began through education. I began to hear about Adam Smith, and in the light that you mentioned in terms of people criticizing him, and I began to loathe him. And unfortunately, it came from the place where I live. So next door, I live in Glenrothes. He comes from Kirkcaldy. And but then again, I started doing a course in PPE because I wanted to understand the origin of all this mess we find ourselves in the world today. And so I took a course, Politics, Philosophy, and Economics, about 3 years ago with the Open Uni. And when I did my economics module, I decided to read The Wealth of Nations. And only then I began to fall in love with Adam Smith. Because I thought, you know what, the guy, from what I've heard, and the anger I had towards capitalism, they called him the father, like you mentioned. By reading The Wealth of Nations, I began to say, you know, why? So I have two questions. The first one is what you mentioned earlier on, and it's something I've observed, and I go in high schools making speeches to inspire young people to go back to their Scottish roots, because I'm very proud African Scot. And I always remind them this is a country of enlightenment and brilliant thinkers. A lot of world development is based on a lot of Scottish discovery. You mentioned something about our understanding has gone backwards. So why is that, and what can we do? Because I'm passionate to contribute toward the society for what they have done and given me. The second question is, what role has the so-called globalization, and you will decide when that process started, has played in making Adam Smith a contradictory figure? Thank you.
By gum. I mean, Madam, may I just say, first of all, what a marvellous example you set of a Scottish spirit of improvement. and how fantastic it is to hear your story. Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you for your frighteningly pungent and appropriate questions, which I'm going to try to answer. So let me just talk a little bit about the broader context, and I'll come to the two questions you raised. So, first of all, you must understand that capitalism, in this exploitative sense, is not a system for which Smith would have had any sympathy at all. Smith is a very pungent critic of markets that are not doing their job, and the most famous example, I think, and the one that is often misunderstood, sometimes is regarded as, indeed, on the wrong side of the argument, is the case of the slave trade. He's occasionally accused of being an apologist for the slave trade. The exact opposite is true. From the 1750s onwards, Smith was a very vigorous opponent on both moral and economic grounds of the slave trade. It's a thing you find in his lecture on jurisprudence. You find it referred to in Wealth of Nations, and there are traces earlier. And he has the strongest possible objections to it. He thinks it's bad business, and he thinks it's morally abhorrent. So that concept of markets as exploitation is something that he would have regarded with great disfavor. And the idea of recruiting him to support that view, which some people might seek to do in the name of a red and tooth and claw capitalism of a kind, is wrong. Of course, Smith doesn't think markets are panaceas. He thinks that a competitive market is a very useful and valuable thing, but he thinks markets can go wrong. They can get stuck in a bad equilibrium in a rather Keynesian way. He thinks that he's absolutely not a utopian, and he's not a one-size-fits-all theorist. So that's quite important to say. The other thing is that Smith is extremely hostile to sources of human inequality. So Smith's own system of natural liberty, the most plausible way of thinking of it is that it's a system in which it's very hard for inequalities of capital to occur, because markets are regarded as competitive when they're working properly. They compete away a lot of any surplus. He thinks that he does not want capital to be passed down by primogeniture from one generation to the next and consolidated in that way. And of course, he thinks workers need to have more voice and more equality in their market transactions with their masters. He says, if there's in any situation in which there's a law favoring the workers over the masters, one should always support that law because of the inbuilt disadvantage they operate in relative to their masters. So I think we can dispel that idea that Smith is on the wrong side of these arguments pretty wholeheartedly. Let me come very quickly to the questions you raised. How has our understanding gone backwards? I think in some ways our understanding of markets has gone backwards. So the conventional economic view of markets at the moment, and I'm slightly caricaturing, and it's less true of the last 15 years than it was before, is one which is derived from the mathematics of markets. So it's essentially a rather static account which attributes preferences and utility functions to economic actors, and then asks how would they behave in certain conditions. Smith's picture is not that. First of all, there's no such thing as economics. There's political economy, because property and the state are mutually interdependent. The second is that there's no such thing as the economy independent of society and the rest of its surrounds. So that view can be very useful and has proven to be staggeringly useful for modeling purposes, but it's not an accurate account of how markets actually work. And I think it's fascinating to see how many of the top present economists are rediscovering through the back door a political economic understanding of markets that's much more dynamic and much more evolutionary than the one they've had. And I think that's discovering Smith by the back door. Very quickly, globalization. Well, globalization, as you will know, as someone who's come here from Africa, the mobile phone has done more to improve well-being across the world, and in particular in the continent of Africa, than any aid I think has ever done. And and that's an enormously welcome development. Globalization through markets is continuing to lift people out of poverty faster across the world than any other at any other time in history. But there's a huge but, which is that in-country inequality in many countries is going up. And I think it's fair to say that for many, many years, the Washington consensus around economics and on globalization was too economically focused. So people did not ask themselves the question, what are the distributional consequences of these changes? And are we, for example, sucking talent out of, through free labour markets, out of developing countries in a way that might actually be condemning them to stagnation or slower parts of development. I'm sorry, that's a rather long answer, but I hope you don't mind my answering a rather deep set of questions in a slightly longer way.
Too close together in the corner, so it might be convenient to take them both together.
I was going to ask, do you think Adam Smith would have voted to leave the EU?
And do you want to ask your other question?
Well, can I thank you for a very, very interesting talk. Could you give us who contemporary would most, in your point of view, equal Adam Smith?
Gosh. When I used to teach philosophy, if someone asked me a question I couldn't answer, I'd say thank you so much for your contribution. Next question, please. So let's go to the question, would Adam Smith vote to leave the EU? Of course, it is a parlour game, isn't it? I mean, what would Adam Smith think of Love Island? Yeah. Where's Adam Smith on Beyonce's new single? What does he think about the hijab? I mean, we can have these conversations. What we can say is two things. One is that The Wealth of Nations is a brilliant analysis of the benefits of markets, and one of the key points that Smith makes very early on in The Wealth of Nations is that the deeper the market, the more the division of labour, the greater level of specialisation, the more value added. So if you think in the short term that Britain's future best lies from a deep market perspective, then you're going to be part of it. You're going to use a Smithian analysis to support staying in the EU. If you think over the longer term, Britain's long-term future is best served by access to rapidly developing markets outside, you're going to go for a more Brexit type view. I think there's a really interesting further nugget which I'll just give you, which is in 1778, Smith is asked, at the time when the American colonies are revolting, and the Brits are really struggling to know what to do about it, and indeed the war is starting to go backwards. Smith is asked what he would do about it, what his view is, and he writes, in many ways, it's a model of a policy paper, including a series of kind of potential approaches. And the one he opts for, ultimately, is to say that the colonists should be given, since their problem is no taxation without representation, they should be given representation in the British Parliament. And then, of course, he says, but of course, if they do, then the seat of sovereignty must inevitably move from Britain to the colonies, which I think is a rather brilliant distillation of some of the panics that people have had about sovereignty on the Brexit side of the argument. As regards the person who is most like Adam Smith now, I think it's very hard to say. If one means as a philosopher-economist, I think it probably would be generally regarded as a man called Amartya Sen, who's a very brilliant welfare economist and philosopher. And by an extraordinary coincidence, he's written a blurb on the back of my book.
Right. Okay, good. We're beginning to get numbers. So if we could take the two at the back, and then we will take. I've lost one.
Two at the back, two here, and then one here.
Yes, we'll do them in that sequence. So you've got your places booked in the sequence.
I think probably quick questions, and I'll try and be quicker on the answers.
Hi. What did he have to say about immigration or emigration? And I'm not just talking about between countries, but maybe from rural communities into cities.
Should we keep cracking on while I desperately think what the answer to that question is?
Hi, Jesse. Why do you think he was so adamant about actually getting his work destroyed on his death?
Yes, very good, thanks. Okay, so why don't we take those two and we'll come down to the other one. Come down to the other folks. So what does Smith say about immigration or emigration? I'm not sure is the answer to that question. It's not clear to me that those issues were really identified as salient issues for purposes of policy at the time. People coming in with seditious ideas, yes. The processes of colonization, yes. Slavery in terms of the way people are being moved around, yes. but what you might call large-scale patterns of labour movement between one country and another. I'm just not sure about that. I don't have a very convincing or interesting answer to that question, I'm afraid. Perhaps I can reflect on it a bit further. On the question of why he destroyed his work, we just don't know, and he didn't say why, but we can hazard a couple of guesses, or 2 or 3 different sets of factors. The first is Smith was a very retiring man. I mean, he was not a person. He was not of a confessional disposition, if I can put it that way. The second thing is Smith had a theory. He had a theory for everything. And Smith had a theory of why that was the position to hold, and that was that a man or a woman's reputation is part of their personal property. He believed that there is what he called a jus sinceri aestimationis, a right to a kind of clean reputation. And he vigorously and jealously guarded that. And when he was worried that some of his work was being ripped off by Robertson or Blair, he could get quite testy in protecting his priority. And in fact, there's a talk he gives early on, of which we have a scrap, which from the 1750s, which contains many of the themes of The Wealth of Nations of 1776. And that's because he's having these ideas, and he doesn't want anyone publishing before him, so he gives a talk in one of the big Edinburgh, I think it may have been a Glasgow club, just to make it perfectly clear that he'd had the ideas first and segregates. And that's where you get this famous line about peace and easy taxes being, as it were, all a country needs, rule of law, a tolerable administration being what a country needs for success. I scout a slightly different theory, which is that I think Smith, by the end of his life, had to come to terms with the fact that he couldn't fit those 2 extra works that he had on the anvil into this wider picture of human exchange that united the work that he had. And I think he almost obsessively revises the 2 great works in interlinkage with each other, thus completely giving to the lie that they're somehow opposed, because he wants to bring out those linkages and make them as good as possible. And he knows that if they are published, they will be enough to secure his immortality. And he certainly doesn't want to, as it were, undermine that by putting out something that he would regard as half-baked. So that's my suggestion.
Okay, thank you. Since we're getting a bit pressed for time, the fairest thing, I think, is to take all 3 of our remaining questions in one go. So if we start there and work in a sweep across here.
There's a lady here, and then there are a cluster of questions over here. I'm quite keen to take another double X chromosome question, if I may.
I'm interested in the idea of state intervention.
Yes.
In Smith's time, of course, we did have things like the forfeited Jacobite estates, providing revenue as almost a proto-Keynesian intervention, setting up the Edinburgh School of Arts and things like that.
Yes.
So it wasn't unknown. But nowadays we have strange instruments. We had the Widening Markets Initiative under Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, and Sir Michael Lyons telling every non-departmental public body to sweat its assets and making civil servants into mini capitalists and so on. We have now this thing in Edinburgh. There's a dreadful illustration, I think. It's called the Growth Accelerator model, in which an American pension company based in North Carolina, which has over $1 trillion under management, is given a subsidy from our taxes of $100 million to kickstart a development for a shopping mall in the East End of Edinburgh, which is undermining Princes Street and the West End. Fraser's store has just closed, and it was stated that because of the East End development, therefore their viability as a retail point was wiped out. So this is based on the Chicago concept of the TIF, the tax increment funding, and it's in this country known as the Growth Accelerator model. This, to me, is an absolutely destructive intervention of the state in a free market. And we're seeing it in Edinburgh, you know. So I just wonder what would Smith have said, I suppose, is my question.
Okay, if we
should we keep cracking on, sir?
And then if we can bring a mic to...
Keep going.
All right, yeah, thank you for your insightful talk. So obviously Adam Smith has views on the markets and, the invisible hand and how at times they may be random. Nowadays everyone talks about, every 10 years there's a correction, i.e. crash, and we're anticipating one in the next 2 years, or some people are anticipating it. So what would you say Adam Smith would think about that? How does that relate to his views, these 10-year corrections in the markets?
Okay.
If we could come to the lady.
Thank you for bluntly agreeing with the positions I've been pushing for the last 15 years on Adam Smith being wrong in both directions. But mine goes back to that Chicago model which was mentioned earlier, and that is that given that Adam Smith explicitly says that he cannot see a model in which there can be consumerism as the driver of an economy, how is it, given that he also has a fundamental belief in an infinitely exploitable world, that we can return to Adam Smith now, having rejected the Chicago model for its failures in generating the derivatives market crashes based on the consumerist view of mortgages 10 years ago?
Gosh, okay. Thank you very much. Let me just pick those questions up quickly, if I may, then, and then I'll release you to your glass of refreshing something or other. So state interventions. I hope you won't mind, but I'm not going to get dragged into the boggy morass of politics in Edinburgh. But I think it's fair to say that Smith invites us to a more nuanced conception of the state, not just places where the state can harm people, but also harm welfare and harm functioning markets, but also places where it can improve it. And there is a very wide range of state interventions that Smith is prepared to contemplate for various different reasons. I mean, let's just name some of them. The Navigation Acts, taxing spirits more than beer to reduce the consumption of alcohol, the granting of temporary monopolies to stimulate overseas trade, a duty in law to pay workers in cash rather than in kind, higher taxes on rents in kind than on money rents, compulsory registration of mortgages, enforcement of building standards, sterling marks on silver plate, special regulation of the banks, even a 5% limit on the rate of interest to discourage speculation. This is not the caricature position of Smith as a libertarian. So I think we need to guard against that view. There's a further slight bear pit here, which is, so what theory should we adopt in relation to markets? It's all very well Jesse saying we need to be more, but we can't just have a connoisseurial form of government. So, statecraft can't just rely on having a few wise or not wise self-appointed guardians who tell us when a state intervention is good and when it's bad. We need a theory. And what I think the theory should do is to take the current theory of market failure and supplement it and add to it. And the way it can do that is by asking a series of more detailed questions about how markets and the market in question actually functions and what good it serves and what forms of detriment it creates and how those detriments are allocated and whether there is in fact effective competition in the market. And the book is in part a vigorous polemic against the empty rhetoric of free markets and in favor of effective competition, because that's what really drives welfare. On the issue of 10-year corrections, you're really thinking about financial markets, I would guess. Smith thinks that we have to be a particularist about markets. And if we are a particularist about markets, then we have to distinguish between product markets, so-called haircuts and hamburger markets, where the goods are purchased at a price publicly known, consumed, and then bought again, and asset markets, which have two-way prices where the assets don't disappear. And asset markets behave very differently to haircuts and hamburger markets. The classic invisible hand model works beautifully for haircuts and hamburger product markets. And asset markets have a logic that is, in many ways, very different. and are prone to overshooting and irrational exuberance and the rest of it. And that's we see that in the financial markets, and we see it in the housing market, and we see it in the toxic combination of the two, as in 2008. And Smith is a corrective to that. And his solution, in line with the description I talked earlier about, I made earlier about party walls, is more of a prudential and less of a gameable approach. So the idea of a party wall is you ask yourself, how thick should the wall be, etc. So you just build a large party wall and stop the conflagration from taking place. The same way you have a maxim which says, I'm not greatly concerned about whether or not this is tier 1 capital of X form, tier 2 capital of X, Y form, or the rest. What I'm going to say is, you're going to put aside 20% of your capital or 10% of your capital, and if we take a hit on economic value generated, we take it in the short term, but we prevent the total engulfment of the economy as a result. And sometimes, of course, these things, you have to have mechanisms to, as Mervyn King memorably said, make sure the punch bowl is regularly taken away. If you want to have that happen from the markets, and you also have to have records. You have to also have mechanisms to crack down on crony capitalism, of which I give a fairly pitiless Smithian analysis. Now, madam, may I say what an honour it is to agree with you in the many ways you've described. Smith has views on both sides of the argument you describe. So one of the important points about the wealth of nations is that it is a defense of commercial society. It is a defense of consumption to that extent as the, as it were, final purpose of economic activity. But it is not a celebration of materialism. And the same is true in the theory of moral sentiments. And in fact, there's a marvelous phrase that Smith has when he's talking about this. He talks about trinkets of frivolous utility. And he has a very interesting analysis of how exactly the same factors that cause people to undertake competitive activity in markets, which are the natural desire, every man's natural propensity to truck, barter, and exchange, that is accompanied by a tendency he regards in very ambiguously, which is to admire the rich and the powerful. An irrational tendency to admire the rich and the powerful. And he thinks that's a fuel for competitive activity, but he also thinks it's a source of materialism that's ultimately quite morally corrupting. And that is a fascinating dilemma with which we continue to rest. And the same, almost exactly the same kinds of worries about the commercialization of the public realm that we find today are echoes of similar kinds of worries, often on more explicitly religious grounds, that people had about the effects of commercialization in the 18th century. Yet again, another way in which reading Smith in those contexts can make us think more intelligently about our own. Thank you very much.
Well, it's my pleasant responsibility to thank Jesse Norman on your behalf. I have to say that in a long experience of chairing events of roughly this kind, I don't think I've ever heard quite so many questions that led me to think, gosh, I'm glad I'm not the one that has to answer that. I noticed, and I'm sure you noticed, that at no point did Jesse resort to the trick of hiding his failure to answer one question behind a concentration simply on another. I think that it was very generous of Jesse to take particular care to ensure that every question was addressed directly. It's something of a cliche in these situations to say that we have been given food for thought as we leave here and go home. But self-evidently, from watching your faces, that's exceptionally true of the benefit we've had from listening to Jesse this evening. There are two opportunities now ahead of you. One is access to free drink, and the other is access to the opportunity to buy Jesse's book. And
well, that's a losing proposition. Hopefully they can do both.
Well, it may be that by not taking the punch bowl away, we will construct a relationship between the two.
Touché.
And that the free drink will encourage a more liberal attitude towards the purchase of the book. Thank you very much, Jesse.